very much for coming. Maybe in short I will say a few words about my background, who I am, so you will have a better understanding of what I'm going to tell you. I'm a Sovietologist, which is, well, I'm teaching here at ILIA Soviet and post-Soviet studies. I started about 5 years ago. And the interesting thing is that when I started, people looked at me with big, bewildered eyes, like, what is Sovietology? Because isn't the Soviet Union dead? But unfortunately, due to the developments over the past 2 or 3 years, in particular in Russia, people suddenly start to remember that actually the Soviet Union is not something which is dead, but very much alive. It might be called something else now, but the spirit and the imperial kind of character of the Soviet Union as it was is still very much with us. And I'm afraid in quite a few years to come. Initially I wanted to talk only about political repression in Russia, but I made the theme a little bit larger. I definitely will be talking about political repression in Russia, but it's part of a much bigger picture. And I will try to, give you some kind of broad lines of what is happening at your big neighbor upstairs. That's why I retitled the presentation into Russia 1 year after Maidan. Maidan, of course, took place in Kiev exactly a year ago, right? It's now 1 week plus a year after the first attack of the riot police Berkut at Maidan. Which was a huge victory, which was very much the result of the weather, because it was freezing cold, and when Berkut attacked the municipal building on Khreshchatyk in Kiev, the demonstrators sprayed the stairs with water, which turned it into one big, ice slide, and so Berkut just didn't manage even to get to the building. And now, of course, a year later, we see Ukraine, a country at war with Russia, an ongoing war, a long-lasting war probably, and lots of other problems. This is Moscow about 2 months ago, or not even 2 months ago, it's the beginning of November, the parade commemorating the victory over Nazi Germany. No, it's in May, sorry. The victory over Nazi Germany, and it's a Russia that actually we very much hope we will never see again. But the old Russia, as it was, is very much back. Right? And these are images of Russia this month. We see the course of the exchange rate of the ruble going down enormously. It's now kind of restabilized temporarily, but the price is now double of it was a year ago. Unmarked graves. Outside Rostov there is a cemetery with over 4,000 unmarked graves, with only a number. And the average age, the age of the person in the ground, because lots and lots of Russians are dying in Ukraine, but are not supposed to have been there, so they are buried in unmarked graves. Russian military equipment moving in on a regular basis into Donetsk Oblast. And in Russia itself, and in particular Crimea, empty shells. Because of the sanctions, which Putin says were imposed by the West, but actually it's the sanctions that he imposed on his own people in reaction to Western sanctions, put on him and his fellow cronies. And this is the new hashtag in Russia. It used to be Krimnash, but now it's Krizisnash. Right? And yet, if you look a few years back, beginning of 2011, this was what you could still see in Moscow. Big demonstrations, mass demonstrations, protesting against the falsification of the parliamentary elections, demanding a resignation of Putin. You probably all know the name of the Bolotnaya Dela, the criminal case against demonstrators at Bolotnaya who were arrested after a clear provocation to force them to react to the police. All of them have been sentenced to terms in prison up to 4 years. And these type of demonstrations you don't see anymore. Bolotное дело is actually the starting point for Putin to eradicate opposition within his country. And this is a demonstration now in Russia, right? It's one-person pickets. Because if you demonstrate with two people, you are arrested. So what happens is you demonstrate as a single person, and then you pass on your placard to the next person, to the next person, to the next person, and that's the only way you can demonstrate with more than one person. Now, of course, if you look into history, Russia has a rather long history of harsh treatment of opposition. And this is the rebellion of the Streltsy in Moscow, who rebelled against Peter the Great, who was traveling in Europe, learning how to build ships in the Netherlands, going to England, etc., etc. And he came back and they crushed the rebellion, and for 7 years in a row, they were torturing and killing members of this opposition group, right? And Peter the Great himself nicely participated in the torturing and in the killing, and among the people that he killed himself was actually his own son. So, you know, there is a kind of link there. Then more recent, we know the Soviet Gulag, and these are photos from remnants of the camps up north, near Salakhat and Igarka. And I put on purpose this papyrosi here, Bielomor, which are now already difficult to buy. But Bielomor stands for a huge building complex using political prisoners with almost no value. This canal which was built is hardly ever used. And a lot of dissidents in the Soviet Union in the 70s and 80s were smoking Bielomor to commemorate those who were killed by Stalin as part of the Gulag. And then, tragically, if you look in Moscow, this is Lubyanka Square, the former Dzerzhinsky Square. This is the KGB headquarters up there. And initially, until 1991, Dzerzhinsky was standing in the middle of that square. He was removed after the failed coup in August 1991. And there's still now all the time attempts to get Dzerzhinsky back to the square. But the monument to the victims of that organization is kind of nicely pushed away to the side in the bushes. It's a big stone from Sovietsky Islands, the first concentration camps. And it's kind of hidden. And why it's hidden is that it would be so unpleasant for these KGB officers sitting in that building to watch all the time a monument to their victims. Right? So if you look at Russia, a key element of their policy and their whole behavior on the international scene is the result of this conspiracy syndrome, right? And it's a conspiracy syndrome which has a long history, again, in this country. These are books that were published in Soviet times about the CIA, espionage, terrorism, and nasty plans. CIA targeted the USSR with a foreign voice about Western radio stations. And they all show that the West was, you know, scheming against the Soviet Union in order to finish it off. The same books are now reappearing, same authors, but they are now focusing, they replaced just USSR with Russia, but the content is exactly the same. The language is exactly the same. And one of the most successful authors at the moment is this character, Philip Bobkov, who was for many years head of the 5th Directorate of the KGB, which is a department that dealt with dissidents, right? And this is one of his recent publications, How They Prepared Traitors. And it's all about how, you know, all these oppositionists in Russia are actually agents of world imperialism. A key element in this whole debate within Russia is this fight between the Slavophiles and the Westerners. And the Westerners who believe that Russia should follow the course of Western-style parliamentary democracy and liberalism. And the Slavophiles who believe that Russia is something unique with a mission in the world and can never follow what happens in the West because it doesn't fit to the Russian soul and to Russian orthodoxy. Putin very much aligning himself with the Slavophiles, right? And there is one speech that he gave a year and a half ago in September 2013 at Volve, which is this, you know, it's a place between St. Petersburg and Moscow where they meet once a year in order to discuss the future of Russia, economic situation, etc., etc. This year it didn't take place at Volve, but in Sochi, because, you know, how much? 60 billion was put into Sochi, so somebody needs to use the facility over there. But this speech is key to the whole way of thinking of Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. And he believes that Russia should not follow the Western course, should not follow the Western example, Western liberalism, because it's morally decayed, it's rotten to the core. And you know, a prime example why it's rotten is because of the acceptance of homosexuality in Western society, right? So it's, as he says, the West is on the path of degradation and primitivism, resulting in a profound demographic and moral crisis. Russia, on the other side, is this nation which has a historical destiny. It's the peacekeeper in Europe. And as an example of this peacekeeping, it's, of course, the victory over Napoleon in 1812. It's the victory over Nazi Germany in the Second World War, the Great Patriotic War. And what is now his kind of new line is that actually it's Russia that was victorious in the First World War. That if Russia would not have beaten the Germans, you know, the First World War would have ended in a different way. So he's stealing the history, as it were, and trying to claim it for Russia. And Russia, as a peacekeeper, has to, you know, maintain the stability in Europe. And, you know, as an example, he needs to send in his peacekeepers. And an example of his peacekeepers are these nice convoys which enter Ukraine on a regular basis. And number 10 is now already going to enter. And the only thing is they're not really bringing humanitarian aid. Most of the trucks are empty. Part of the content is actually military equipment. And what this humanitarian convoy is doing in particular is pulling out the dead Russian soldiers who died at the battlefield and stealing factories. Because with a high speed, the factories in Donetsk Oblast and Luhansk Oblast are being stolen and moving into Russia, right? So thievery is now called peacekeeping. And so Russia and the West are culturally incompatible. And then, as far as Russia is concerned, he says, you know, it's a multicultural society, but in order to maintain the balance, Russianism, Russians need to be the core. This is the way in which the society will develop in a harmonical fashion, which is kind of incompatible with what is actually happening in Russia itself, right? Russia has the largest neo-fascist movement in the whole of Europe, right? Putin, as a character, as a political character, is very much similar to Benito Mussolini. Mussolini being the fascist leader of Italy in the 1920s, 1930s, and was eventually disposed by the Germans and then later killed. Mussolini was, like Putin, a very short guy, so overcompensating his physical appearance with, you know, this whole blah blah of rhetoric, and Putin is doing exactly the same. He is overcompensating himself, cultivating his body. He's probably the leader who is seen more than anybody else with his bare chest, showing how strong he is, judo, and catching huge fish. This is the big story in 2013 that he claims that he caught a fish of 23 kilos. And then immediately on the internet photos appeared with much bigger fish, which then happened to weigh only 9 kilos or 11 kilos. But in Putin's case, it's 23 kilos, right? And it's nationalism, and it's all the same elements as what Benito Mussolini had in the 1920s. So a very essential element with Russia at this moment is that this kind of growing neo-fascism as becoming part of the political culture in Russia. And then if you imagine that Russia is at the moment very close with a lot of the strong right-wing neo-fascist parties in Western Europe and actually financing them, you see a very unholy alliance appearing. In Soviet times, the Soviet Communist Party was financing Western communist parties and the peace movement and stuff like that. Now the Единая Россия in Russia, the Russian state, is financing or co-financing right-wing political movements in Europe. Front National in France, Jobbik in Hungary, and this is really a very scary combination. If we look at Russia, what we call the country is now in a phase of Putin's China. There are some people who say, no, it's not Putin's China, it's the Andropov China. Right? Andropov was head of the KGB for many years, from 1967 onwards, and is, what you could say, the spiritual godfather of Putin. And the methods that Putin is using within the country is all very much according to the way in which Andropov was fighting the internal diversion, as he called it, ideological diversion, the opposition within the country itself. We all know that he came from the KGB. These are some photos of him in his youth. Those two at the top are very interesting. This is a demonstration in Leningrad in 1989, which is being beaten up by policemen. And coincidentally, there is this nice guy standing there with his cap on, instructing them how to beat up people, and that happens to be Putin, right? But most people remember him as this grey mouse. Here he is, there he is, carrying the bag of the mayor of St. Petersburg, a grey mouse in the background, right? But this is very, very scary, because who was also a grey mouse in Soviet period, Josip Vissarionovich Stalin. Nobody expected him to become what he was, because he was such a grey mouse in the background, but nicely scheming in order to get to his position. If we look at Putin's background, we know that at the age of 16 he went to the KGB to get himself recruited, and they told him, listen, we choose our people, you don't come to us, we come to you. Right? He then, for quite a few years, tried to show how good a KGB agent was, so you can imagine what that means, that he's writing denunciations on his fellow students. And then at the age of 23, he was recruited, and eventually became a mediocre colonel of the KGB in a very, unimportant city like Dresden. Right? However, what is very important, that while sitting in Dresden, he nicely built up his German network, which very much helped him to become filthily wealthy afterwards. Because it's all business deals with people that he knows still from his DDR time. Then when he was in St. Petersburg, he was in charge of the Food for Oil program, which was linked with Germany. So Germany was buying oil and in exchange would deliver food to the hungry population of Leningrad. The oil was delivered, the food was never bought. And, tens of millions of dollars disappeared. And what we now can assume is, considering the wealth of Putin, that this is one of the big steps for him to acquire his wealth. Right? There is now also allegations that he was involved in the death of Sobchak. Formerly, Sobchak died because of a heart attack. Now there are serious doubts, and they think that he might actually have been poisoned. Another fact, the Chechen war started after apartment blocks were bombed in Russia. Several hundred citizens were killed. Immediately the Chechens were blamed, and this was the trigger to send in the Russian army. We know now pretty well for sure that it was actually the FSB that blew up these buildings. And what then happens is that Putin gradually becomes president of Russia on this wave of patriotism. In Chechnya, first having a scorched earth war, killing tens of thousands of people, and then replacing Russian troops by the so-called Kadyrovцы. Ramzan Kadyrov, first his father, then Ramzan himself, who has his Kadyrovtsi, who are now also fighting in Ukraine, which is a gang which is basically, you could say, the worst type of traitors. They're killing their own people. They're killing Chechens on behalf of Russia, right? And they're now killing Ukrainians on behalf of Russia. And it's amazing. I have Russian friends on my Facebook, lots of them, but also quite a few pro-Putinists who now see Kadyrov as a hero. And I write, he's a murderer. How do you mean he's a murderer? How do you know he's a murderer? Well, the interesting thing is there's a lot of footage on TV of Kadyrov actually killing Russian troops, right? But now he's certainly a hero for the Russians, right? Another very interesting is this attack on the theater in Northwest in Moscow, in which I think 140 people died because the FSB was using special gas, which was lethal. One of the terrorists who was involved in this attack on Northwest is working in the Presidentura, right? So how is it possible, if this is a terrorist attack, that one of the terrorists is then working with Putin? So it's a very clear indication that actually it was organized, right? And the same doubt is now starting to appear about Beslan. Is that really a terrorist attack, or was it also organized in order to, to keep the patriotic fervor going in Russia? What we also know is the strong link between criminality and the Presidentura. There is at least one coronated Bor of Zakonie who is working in the Presidentura. And we see it all the time, this link with criminality. Putin's big buddy is this leader of the bikers, which is a pretty fascist group in Russia, which was involved in the acquisition or the annexation of the Crimea, was then active in eastern Ukraine. Of course, the big biker got a medal from Putin. He also got a medal from the church, right? The church is playing a very double role in all this. And it's quite understandable why. Because actually the patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church is Vladimir Gundyaev, and Vladimir Gundyaev is a KGB agent. So you have a state which is run by the KGB, and you have a church which is run by the KGB. I can give you a very nice example about Gundyaev. I happen to know in Ukraine the former deputy head of the Secret Service, of the SBU. And so Patriarch Kirill comes to Kiev for this 1,000 years existence of the Kiev Rus. And they're standing there in a small group talking. So this deputy head of the SBU is there as well. And suddenly a guy comes up and slaps Kirill on the back and says, "Hey, Volodya, как дела?" Right? And everybody is completely shaken. How can you, this is Patriarch. He says, "Какой Патриарх? Это Володя. Мы вместе учились в КГБшной школе." Right? So, his position is pretty clear, and they are nicely working together, and with the criminality. And for instance, the current Prime Minister, Aksyonov in the Crimea, is part of a local mafia, was involved in killings, right? Goblin is his nickname. This is a joke about corruption in Russia. And so if in Russia they would amputate hands for thievery, for voting in the Duma, they would install pedals instead of buttons, because nobody would have any hands anymore to vote. And then if you look in eastern Ukraine, this is the leadership of Luhanskaya Oblast, of the LNR, and Donetskaya Oblast, the DNR, right? Actually, what we see in eastern Ukraine is that these regions have been taken over by local criminal gangs. And so a lot of the infighting between them, because they're not only fighting the Ukrainians, they're also fighting themselves, is because they are fighting for criminal territory. And the interesting thing is that the increased opposition in Russia against supporting these guys has one particular reason, and that is that they say, listen, we have our own criminals. We have enough criminals. Why do we need more criminals? Right? It just confuses us. We don't get anything out of this. In the years, we've seen an increased level of nepotism and clanism. And so all the kids turn into little Medvedevs and all the old ladies into little Putins, right? And this Kabayeva, the lover of Putin, is now in charge of a big media conglomerate. And just a few weeks ago, another gymnasist was suddenly declared as head of the department in the Presidentura to check on the implementation of the laws of the Presidentura, right? So it's all his girlfriends and other connections which are all put in place to keep things under control. In the meantime, we see that there is an increased number of people leaving the country, in particular Russians with money, right? So far, according to statistics, at least 200,000 Russians have left the country with their money. And places where they go to, a lot, Riga, Latvia in general, Vilnius, I see an enormous increase. And the real estate prices are going up very quickly because Russians are buying apartments, not just apartments, but including the furniture, including even the forks and knives in the kitchen, because they just want to be able to move in with their suitcases, right? And under Putin, the ethnic tension in the country has increased enormously. And this is, it is all part of how to put it, it's a part of the same way of running a country as Adolf Hitler tried to do in the 1930s, which is creating what you call a Volksgemeinschaft, a national community. In order to create a national community, you need two enemies. You need the external enemy, right? Well, the external enemy is clear, it's the West, and all these neo-Bandero fascists in Ukraine. And the second enemy needs to be inside the country itself. And in the case of Hitler, it was the Jews, and he has a more kind of combined version of who the internal enemy is. It's the non-Russian part of the population, Muslims, which are the big threat. Allowing anti-Semitism to prosper in Russia, because it's going very quickly now. And then also, you know, the fifth column, as you could call, the people's traitors, right? And some people in Russia, just to show you how crazy things can get, actually believe that Putin is an agent of world Zionism. Why is he an agent of world Zionism? Because Putin's policy is leading to the destruction of Russia, which is what world Zionism wants. So it's world Zionism that put Putin there, Putin put Medvedev there, and so Kadyrov is actually also an agent of world Zionism. Right? And so while at Valde he's talking about this harmony and the natural being of Russia, at the same time he's doing everything possible to kind of put oil on the volcano, right? Strong racist views. This is a Twitter that a friend of Putin posted. She is the one who lit the torch of the Olympic Games in Sochi. She put that one, member of the Duma, showing that Obama and his wife are just monkeys. And again, the role of the Russian Orthodox Church, and there is within this church this very conservative nationalist group which believes that Russia needs to return to its borders of 1913, right? So Finland at the Nasha, Polska at the Nasha, Pribaltica, you don't even have to talk about it, Ukraine, of course, Nasha, Moldova, Nasha, but everybody needs to be turned into a Russian Orthodox, because then the problem with the Muslims is gone, right? And this anti-Semitism and racism all over the place, right? These are two recent ones. You know, the whole part of this whole propaganda is, of course, to show that the leadership in Ukraine after Yanukovych is all a Jewish fascist gang, right? Judeo-Banderism, as they call it. So we will remove the Yet oligarchy in one go, right? Or what is in Kiev is the Yet junta. And actually, if you look at the results of the elections, the number of right-wingers in Ukraine is considerably lower than in the rest of Europe. Pravi Sector and this Swoboda, they didn't even get 5% of the votes, right? Whereas Front National in France has 25%. New style patriotism. We took the Crimea, now all the pedophiles to the camps and all the Yits to Israel, and we can start to live. And Shenderovich, this humorist, is considered to be the fifth Jewish column. Right? And this is, you know, this says it all. A fantastic combination. Slava Sovietskого Союза, and then at the same time the Hitler sign. Right? It's a complete mix of totalitarian thought. So if we look at human rights in Russia at this stage, it's anti-non-governmental organizations. It's just trying to eradicate this whole layer of civil society, anti-LGBT, of course, and creating an atmosphere in the country which is based on one simple mechanism, and that is fear. Soviet fear. Right? And it works very nicely. Because it's so much in the genes that you only have to push a couple of buttons and it's all back. Political abuse of psychiatry is back again. Just last week, a guy in St. Petersburg was sent for compulsory treatment to a psychiatric hospital because he called for demonstrations on Red Square and for taking over the Kremlin. Extremism, it's called. So his diagnosis is, it's something called sluggish schizophrenia, which is a schizophrenia that you don't see that the person is actually seriously mentally ill, but he is mentally ill and needs to be treated. Right? The press has been basically nationalized, and there is almost no independent press anymore. There's Dorst, which is still available on the internet. There's Echo Moskva, which is about to be closed down, a radio station. And there is one newspaper, Novaya Gazeta, which is not being printed anymore and it's only on the internet. Right? And all three of these three remaining stations or sources are under serious attack. And as I said, this climate of fear. It's what Stalin says, we have internal enemies, we have external enemies, we should never forget about it, my comrades, not even 1 minute. And it's exactly the same type of reasoning. Right? This is a huge banner. You see, this is a man, so you can imagine how big. On the biggest bookstore in Moscow, on Novy Arbat, Dom Knigi. And it says, the fifth column, strangers are among us. And it has the photos of the main, people that are under attack, like Makarevich from Aquarium, like Shenderovich, this humorist. And they combine them with, these guys from the moon, to show them that they don't belong here and, should be basically kicked out of the country or all put behind bars. The big threat for the regime is, of course, social media. Because this is something which is very hard to control, right? And for Putin, Maidan is a total nightmare. The guy who had the similar type of, situation before Putin was Yuri Andropov. Yuri Andropov was ambassador in Hungary in 1956. Was there when the Hungarian uprising took place, and he saw outside the Soviet embassy how members of the Hungarian secret police were hung from lampposts. And he promised himself never to allow that again. So it was Andropov who organized the invasion into Czechoslovakia in '68. He was the one who was putting pressure on Poland. He is the one who pushed for the invasion into Afghanistan. Traumatized by what he saw. Putin has seen this and he understands that with the Maidan in Russia he's finished. So he will do anything possible to avoid this. And for a long time during Maidan, the Russian media was just downplaying. There was a demonstration of 800,000 on Maidan every Sunday. And so Russian TV said, well, there are a few thousand demonstrators out on Maidan. So then this appeared on internet. Especially for the first channel of Russian TV, we are not here. Right? And the big issue is, will the regime be able to block social media, to control social media? And there are a whole number of laws under preparation which have this idea. The idea is that Facebook and Twitter will stop functioning in Russia at the beginning of next year unless they start working on Russian servers. Same counts for iPhones and iPads. The demand of the regime is that everything needs to go via Russian servers. And you understand why. Because then they have all the data. And it's not some tele company which is having these servers, it's the FSB which is having the servers, and they can collect all the data, right, and analyze it. They're working on one switch with which they can disconnect internet throughout the country. And it's clear why they want to do this, because if Maidan starts in Russia, they want to take out the internet, so they will not be able to communicate in this way. And of course it will seriously hamper things, but you know, technology goes further. And also during Maidan, a lot of the people were expecting actually Yanukovych to turn off internet. And they already had their own kind of clouds prepared in order to be able to communicate even without the internet. So, you know, it's a race against the clock. You cannot keep this from taking place, right? At the end of October, a foundation which I'm running, the foundation Иностранный агент, Foreign Agent, published 2 new books. I put them on the table in Russian and English, and you can take a copy. One is the list of political prisoners of Russia. The other is a list of all the laws that have been introduced since Putin took power. And by now there are 22 laws, which, you know, if you look at the laws in combination, it's almost like you get back to Article 58. Article 58 was the accusation that was used in Stalin's times, and it was, you know, very diverse, but basically the main concept was that whatever you do, you're guilty. Whatever you do, there is something that you did wrong. Because if you knew someone who could have known that somebody else was planning or thinking of committing a counter-revolutionary crime, you're guilty, right? And another aspect is the core of Soviet justice is that they don't have to prove that you're guilty, you have to prove that you were not guilty. So, you know, how can you prove that you didn't know that that guy knew someone who was planning some counter-revolutionary act, right? So, what we now see is with these laws, which are, you know, in several categories, and you can see them in the book, they're all kind of shortly analyzed. This guy, who is the chief investigator of Russia, General Bastrykin, says that we need to go back to Soviet legality, which means we need to go back to the situation whereby the presumption of innocence is abandoned. So people need to prove that they are not guilty, right? Bastrykin is a very unpleasant character. And by sheer coincidence, I happen to know the guy because I used to work with him when he was Minister of Justice in St. Petersburg. He comes from the group of around Putin. How to put it? A sleazeball. A very unpleasant character. And the interesting thing is, he was nicely working with our NGO, a Western NGO, anti-Soviet NGO. He was receiving money out of this, and now he's fighting all those who are connected to these bloody capitalists from the West. Right? So it's a very kind of dualism in there, up in his head. The list contains the names of 114 political prisoners, which is, if you consider that in December last year we had 52, in June we had 92, we are now in October at 114, the increase is very quickly. Among them, a large group of bloggers, people who just on the internet were writing what they thought about things, right? In the private blog. I'm posting on Facebook. If I post on Facebook what I think, I could be among them if I were living in the Russian Federation. Foreigners. There are several people from the Crimea who opposed the annexation of the Crimea and are now waiting in jail in St. Petersburg, in Moscow, to be sentenced for extremism, right? One of them, Sentsov, He is a filmmaker. He was, just a few days ago, turned into a Russian citizen. Nobody asked him what he wanted. He's Ukrainian. But the Russian government decided that he's no longer Ukrainian, he's now Russian. So he's not a foreigner, so we can sentence him. They don't ask you whether you want to be Russian, they just tell you you're Russian. Right? Two others are a Ukrainian pilot, Nadia Savchenko, who was abducted from Ukraine and is now in the prison in Moscow, charged with murder. And the other one is a member of the Estonian counterintelligence, Evan Kovar, who was abducted from Estonia and is now in the FSB prison in Moscow, also charged with several crimes. Right? So, all the time they are trying to see how far they can go. Estonia is a NATO member. Abducting an agent of the counterintelligence from a NATO territory is, is a very serious thing. And the unfortunate thing is there's hardly any reaction. So every time Putin goes one step further and sees how the world reacts. They don't react to this, okay, then we'll do the next. Right? So unless there becomes a kind of closed front and he's immediately punished for what he does, this will be an ongoing affair. Now if you look at the people on the list, there are several things that are springing to the eye, catching the eye. One is a lot of them are very young. I think the oldest is Krivov, who is one of the people from the Bolotnaya Delo. He's 54. Right? Many Muslims among them, which is quite new for us, because if you look at Soviet times, the dissident movement, there was no movement whatsoever under Muslims. There were dissidents among the Baptists, among the Pentecostalists, among the Russian Orthodox, nothing among the Muslims. Now there is a strong movement among the Muslims. And these are not people who are calling for a jihad. Right? The people on the list are those who are non-violent. Right? It's very important to keep in mind. Many bloggers and the Crimeans, we have a big problem because we didn't put them on the list. There are dozens of Crimeans who have disappeared. We don't even know whether they're still alive. There are lots of Crimeans that are behind bars for so-called extremism. But if we put them on the list, it means that we accept that Crimea is part of Russia. So probably what we will be doing in future is a separate list for Crimeans. And so what I did is just to give you an idea, because we are talking about people, right? And some of them are people of your age. I put the photographs of the people in several slides. So if we look at the current situation, what is ahead of us? Because we understand it's not going to be very pleasant. One of the big issues, I think, with the Crimea is that whether you think that Crimea should be part of Russia or should be part of Ukraine or should be independent, this is actually of secondary importance. What is much more important is that safety, security in Europe, peace in Europe was based on one simple notion. Borders are inviolable. Right? We agree what the borders are, we are not going to touch it. And actually Russia signed the Helsinki Agreements in 1975, guaranteeing the borders. In 1994 it signed an agreement with Ukraine and with the United States, guaranteeing the borders of Ukraine, in exchange of which Ukraine gave their nuclear weapons to Russia to be destroyed. The borders are no longer guaranteed, which is the whole safety structure in Europe, which existed for 60 years, has been destroyed by this guy, right? Because it will be very difficult to get back to the situation where people will feel secure behind the borders again. The second that we see is this whole unholy alliance of Putin or the Putinists with right wing in Western Europe, which is very scary, because there is this theory that it's all like a circle. the extreme left wing is very close to extreme right wing. And if you, it's very interesting, in the beginning of the 1930s, Hitler had these forces to beat up people and to, you know, to create terror in the cities, the SA. And about the SA, they always said that they were like beefsteaks. They were brown on the outside, but they were red on the inside, because many of them were former communists. If you now look at Putin's gang, which is walking around in the red jackets with the map of the Soviet Union on the back and then SSSR 2.0, they are the opposite. They are red on the outside, but actually on the inside they are just fascist. Right? Their whole behavior is absolutely fascistic. There is a very nice film I can recommend to you, which is called Putin's Kiss. It sounds like some stupid Hollywood film, but actually it is a film about the organization Nashi, which is an organization that Putin set up in order to, you know, basically dominate the political field in Russia. And it's using young people to, you know, to promote his cause. Fantastic film. As far as Ukraine is concerned, yeah, of course he doesn't have any money to occupy the whole country. And, you know, when I drive around Kiev and I know the mentality of the Ukrainians now, it would be absolute suicide, because they will be on all these, you know, the Khrushchevki and high-rise from Soviet times. You know, it's impossible to find a war over there. But what he wants is a Yugoslavization. Just destabilize the country and basically drive it to ruin, right? Then with the West, he is the one who is all the time creating more tension, because the sanctions from the West are focusing very clearly on specific people who are involved in this policy. What he then does in return is to ban imports from the West, which is hitting his population. And then he says to his population, gee, the West, you know, they're boycotting us. We are suffering because of the West. No, Russians are suffering because of this bloody Putin sitting in the Kremlin, right? And I think what we will see is an increased erosion of Russia itself. And my assumption is that within the next 10, 15 years, we will see Maidans in Russia. Why don't we see them now? Because there is not yet a generation which has lost this fear, the Soviet fear. Right? When I was at Maidan, starting in December, and then through all the way till the very end, the thing that really amazed me was, you know, the driving force of Maidan were actually youngsters, from all the way from 16 up to 30. Young people, the first post-Soviet generation, who had lost this fear, and who had enough. It doesn't matter who is in power as long as they don't steal. This is the most important thing, right? And these were young people who eventually went against bullets in order to fight for their freedom. And this is something that we don't see in Russia yet, and I think we will need another generation for that. At the same time, we see, you know, this increased propaganda, all the time putting more oil on the volcano. These are two posts on a Russian-run website. Russia prepares a nuclear surprise for NATO. Right? So, threatening again with nuclear weapons. It's the first time since the Cuba crisis of '61. Russia takes complete advantage of castrated armed forces of the West, telling us that, you know, the West, they have lost so much of their armed forces that we Russians, we will overrun them. And then combining things with the past again. This guy in the middle is Yazov, who was the Minister of Defense in the Soviet Union, and he was one of the coup leaders against Gorbachev. He now was given a new state medal and declared hero of the Russian Federation by Putin and his other very unpleasant character, Shoigu, who is the current Minister of Defense and who might be playing a significant role in politics in the future. And then as far as Ukraine is concerned, you know, there are several options. One is to keep on destabilizing, which is the white, keep on this LNR and this DNR going, and to make sure that Ukraine slides into an economic chaos. which is in a way happening. The only problem for Putin is that the economic chaos is happening in his country quicker than in Ukraine. The second is his big problem with Crimea, because it's impossible to maintain this. Because the delivery routes for food and oil, etc., are all very limited, and he might have to start a war in order to be able to have a landline with Crimea. And then the big fear is, of course, that with his, lunacy, eventually he will wage war against Ukraine and try to take the whole East and the whole South and create this, fake state of Novorossiya. Thank you very much.